The deed felt like a joke in her hand. Opal turned the thin paper over, the clerk's spidery script declaring her the owner of 300 acres of dust and regret. The land was called the Callaway Breach, a name that tasted of failure. It was all she could afford with the last of the money from her husband's passing, a sum so small the land agent in Harmony Creek, a portly man named Henderson, had barely suppressed a smirk as he counted it. "Borders the Lost Canyon, you know," he'd said, his voice slick with false concern. "Nothing but rock and shadow. They say the whole Callaway herd vanished in there 20 years back, spooked by lightning and just gone. Not a hide nor a horn ever seen again." The men loafing by the general store had chuckled. 20 years. A local ghost story sold for the price of a decent horse. Opal had folded the paper, the heat of their amusement a brand on her neck. She had nowhere else to go. Cast out by her late husband's family, who saw her as a final burden to be shed, she had taken her meager inheritance and walked toward the one place no one else wanted. Now, standing on the edge of her new property, she understood why. The grass was thin, the soil pale and stony. A sagging one-room cabin slumped under the vast, indifferent sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Beyond it, a dark gash split the earth. The Lost Canyon. Its mouth was a maw of fractured rock and tangled skeletal junipers. An old, broken gate of silvered wood leaned across the entrance, more a suggestion than a barrier. The air that breathed from it was cool and smelled of stone and old silence. She spent the first week making the cabin habitable. She patched the roof, swept out the nests of pack rats, and scrubbed the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. The work was a balm, a simple, physical rhythm that kept the whispers of the past at bay. Each evening, she sat on her porch step, a tin cup of weak tea in her hands, and watched the sun bleed out behind the canyon's rim. The town of Harmony Creek was a day's ride away. She was utterly alone, and the quiet was so profound it felt like a presence. On the 8th day, driven by a need to know the edges of her world, she walked the boundary line. The survey stakes were long gone, but the fence line, a ghost of rusted wire and fallen posts, was still visible. It led her inevitably to the canyon mouth. The stories said it was a box canyon, a dead end. Impassable. Cursed. Opal stopped at the leaning gate. The wood was so old it was soft, weathered to the texture of felt. A heavy chain, its links thick with rust, held it loosely to a post. But it was the ground that held her gaze. On her side of the gate, the earth was carpeted in dry pine needles and sun-bleached weeds. But through the gap on the canyon side, the ground was different. It was dark, churned soil, marked not with the delicate prints of deer or coyote, but with the deep cloven cuts of heavy beasts. And there, pressed into the dirt, was a pile of dung. Not old and dry, but dark, and steaming faintly in the cool morning air. Her heart gave a sharp, sudden knock against her ribs. It was impossible. Henderson had said the nearest ranch was 60 miles out. No stray could have wandered this far. She listened, straining her ears against the whisper of the wind through the rocks. Nothing. Just the vast, empty silence. She told herself it was a wild bull, a lone creature that had somehow found its way in. But the ground told a different story. The earth was trampled. This was the work of a herd. She returned the next day and the next. The signs were always there. More tracks. The smell, faint but unmistakable, of livestock. The decay of the canyon's reputation stood in stark contrast to the freshness of the life just beyond the gate. The place was supposed to be dead, a tomb for a long-lost herd. But something was alive in there. On the 4th day, she brought a file. The chain on the gate was thick, but the rust was deep. Her arms ached as she worked, the grating sound of metal on metal shockingly loud in the stillness. Finally, a link gave way with a sharp crack. The chain fell away. She pushed the groaning gate open just wide enough to slip through. The air inside was immediately different. Cooler, filled with the scent of damp earth, pine, and that same animal musk, stronger now. A well-worn trail, wide enough for cattle to walk two abreast, led down into the shadows. She followed it. The rock walls rose steeply on either side, their faces streaked with black lichen. The trail twisted and the bright world of the plains vanished behind her. She was in a world of stone and shade. After walking for a quarter of a mile, the canyon opened into a hidden valley. It was like stepping into another world. A meadow of lush green grass, fed by a creek that stitched its way through the center, spread out before her. And in that meadow, grazing peacefully under the afternoon sun, was a herd of cattle. They were beautiful. Not the rangy, half-wild longhorns common to the territory, but solid, heavy-bodied animals with sleek coats of deep red and white. They lifted their heads as she emerged from the narrow passage, their jaws working slowly as they watched her. There were at least 40 of them. Cows, yearlings, and a half-dozen young calves that stayed close to their mothers. They were calm, healthy, their coats shining with vitality. This was no ghost herd. This was a living, breathing miracle. Opal stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. 20 years. They couldn't be the same animals. They had to be descendants, a breeding population trapped and forgotten. She took a slow step forward, her hand outstretched. A few of the cows blew softly through their noses, but none of them bolted. They simply watched her with their large, dark, liquid eyes. "Well, I'll be," she whispered to the quiet air. A shadow fell over her. "This place isn't for you." The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Opal spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood at the mouth of the trail, not 10 feet from her. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and leather. His face was all angles and shadow under the brim of a stained hat, his jaw dark with several days of stubble. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, not pointing it at her, but holding it with a familiarity that was just as intimidating. He looked as wild and weathered as the canyon itself. I own this land," she stammered, the words feeling thin and foolish. "The Callaway Breach. The deed." "The deed ends at the canyon mouth," he said flatly. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were fixed on her, missing nothing. "You're trespassing." "There were tracks," she said, finding a sliver of courage. "I saw the signs. I thought an animal might be hurt." His gaze flickered to the herd, then back to her. A muscle worked in his jaw. "They're fine. Now turn around and go back the way you came, and fix the gate behind you." He was the recluse the town maps forgot. The man living in the cabin everyone swore was empty. She could feel the warning in his voice, a deep and unyielding command to leave this mystery alone. But she couldn't. She had seen the herd, and now she had seen him. The two were connected. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadier this time. He stared at her for a long moment, his silence a heavy weight. "I'm the man telling you to leave," he said finally. He took a step to the side, clearing the path. It was a dismissal. Opal held his gaze for another second, then turned and walked back the way she had come. Her mind was reeling. A man, living here in secret. A whole herd of cattle, hidden from the world. The story the town told was a lie, or at least, not the whole truth. When she reached the gate, she did as he'd asked, using a length of her own rope to tie it shut, her hands shaking slightly. As she walked back to her cabin, she didn't feel scared. She felt a profound and unsettling curiosity. The lost canyon wasn't empty. It was occupied. She didn't go back for 2 days. She tended her small garden, repaired a section of her fence, and tried to push the image of the man and his hidden herd from her mind. but it was no use. The question of him, of the why of it all, was a hook she couldn't shake. On the third morning, a storm rolled in from the north, a fast, violent squall that turned the sky to slate and lashed the plains with rain and hail. She was inside, checking the patches on her roof for leaks, when she heard a frantic sound from outside. It was the terrified bawling of a calf. She grabbed her coat and ran out into the deluge. The sound was coming from the direction of the canyon. She ran, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. She found it near the creek bed, which was now a churning brown torrent. A young calf, one of the ones she'd seen in the meadow, was tangled in a snarl of old barbed wire washed loose by the flood. It was struggling, tearing its own flesh, its mother circling helplessly on the far bank, her own cries full of distress. Opal didn't hesitate. She waded into the rising water, her boots sinking in the mud. The wire was wrapped tight around the calf's hind leg. She worked at the rusted strands with numb fingers, whispering to the terrified animal, "Easy now. It's all right. I'll get you loose." Suddenly, hands were beside hers. Strong, calloused hands, moving with deft precision. It was him. The man from the canyon. He had a pair of wire cutters in his hand, and he snipped through the barbs with two sharp cracks. He didn't say a word, just worked with a focused intensity. Together, they unwound the wire. The calf, once free, scrambled up the bank and went straight to its mother. The man stood up, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked at Opal, soaked and shivering, her hands scraped and bleeding from the wire. Then he looked at the gash on the calf's leg. It was deep. "It needs stitching," he said, his voice still rough, but without the hard edge of their first meeting. "And a poultice, or it'll go lame." "I have supplies at my cabin," she said over the roar of the wind, "flaxseed, and needle, and thread." He gave a short, sharp nod. He crossed the creek in 2 long strides, calmed the mother cow with a low murmur, and lifted the calf into his arms. He carried it as if it weighed nothing. "Lead the way," he grunted. They walked back to her cabin in silence, the storm raging around them. Inside, the small room felt like a sanctuary. He laid the calf gently on a clean blanket she spread by the stove. While she warmed water and ground the flaxseed for a poultice, he held the animal still, his large hand resting on its back, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father taught me," she said, her hands busy. "We had a small farm back in Ohio." She cleaned the wound, her movements practiced and sure. He watched her, his pale eyes missing nothing. He watched the way she threaded the needle, the way she spoke to the calf in a low, soothing tone, the way her hands were steady despite the cold. She could feel his gaze on her like a physical touch. When she was done stitching, she applied the warm poultice, binding it with a strip of clean cotton. "That should do it," she said, sitting back on her heels. The calf, exhausted, lay quietly, its breathing evening out. She finally looked up at him. "Thank you for your help." "You were the one helping," he said, his voice quiet. He was looking at her hands. "You'll need to put something on those cuts." He stood and walked to the door, then paused. "I'm Nate," he said, without turning around. And then he was gone, disappearing back into the storm as quickly as he had appeared. Opal stared at the door he had closed behind him. Nate. He had a name. She looked at the sleeping calf by her fire, then at her own bleeding hands. Something had shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement of competence, a shared moment of care over a living thing. The wall of his hostility had a crack in it. He brought the calf's mother to the gate of her small corral the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. "She won't settle without him," he said, his eyes on the cow. "He can stay here until the leg is stronger," Opal said. I have enough grass. Nate nodded. He seemed uncomfortable, out of place in the open world outside his canyon. He lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her small, tidy homestead. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the weeded garden, the mended fence. The brand on that cow, Opal said, her voice gentle. It's a Callaway brand, isn't it? A C on a rocking frame. He went very still. The warmth that had flickered between them vanished, replaced by the old wariness. It's just a brand, he said, his voice flat. The Callaway herd vanished 20 years ago. She pressed softly. That's what they say in town. Town talk, he grunted, turning to leave. Don't listen to it. But she had seen his face when she mentioned the name. It wasn't just a brand to him. It was a history. His history. Over the next week, a strange, silent courtship began. Nate never came to the cabin, but she would find signs of him. A stack of freshly split pine by her woodpile, far more than she could have cut herself. A broken rail on her corral, expertly mended. One morning she found a string of trout, cleaned and scaled, lying on a bed of wet leaves on her porch step. He never stayed to be thanked. They were offerings left in the quiet of the dawn. She, in turn, left things for him. A jar of the blackberry jam she'd made. A loaf of fresh bread wrapped in a clean cloth. She would leave them by the canyon gate, and by the next day, they would be gone. She tended to the calf, changing its dressing, talking to it in low tones. Nate would sometimes watch from the mouth of the canyon, a tall, silent figure against the rock. He never approached, but his presence was a constant. She was earning the trust of his animal, and in doing so, she was unknowingly earning his. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson rode out from town. He reined his horse in at her fence line, his gaze dismissive as it swept over her small holding. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone overly familiar. "Settling in, are we?" "I am, Mr. Henderson," she said coolly. His eyes landed on the red cow and her calf in the corral. "Well now, found yourself some strays, I see. That's a fine-looking calf." "They're not strays," Opal said, her body tensing. "No brand I can see from here," he said, squinting. "Unclaimed livestock on open range. The territory has laws about that. A man could put his own mark on them." He smiled, a greasy, knowing expression. "But I'm not here about that. I'm here with an offer. A generous one. I've had a change of heart about this parcel. I'll buy it back from you. For a profit, of course. Double what you paid." Opal stared at him. Double what she paid was still next to nothing. "The land is not for sale." Henderson's smile tightened. "A woman alone out here. It's not safe. And this land is worthless. You're bordering a cursed canyon. Take the money. Go back east where you belong." "I belong here," she said. And the truth of the words surprised her. She looked past him, toward the dark line of the canyon. She was no longer alone. "Suit yourself," he sneered, his good humor vanishing. "But don't say I didn't warn you when you come to your senses." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust. The encounter left a sour taste in her mouth. Henderson's sudden interest wasn't generosity. It was greed. He wanted her land, and she was beginning to suspect it had everything to do with what was hidden in the canyon. That evening, she walked to the canyon gate. She found Nate there, waiting. He had seen Henderson's visit. "He'll be back," Nate said. His face was grim. "He wants the land. He offered to buy me out." "And you told him no," he stated. "I did." He looked at her, and for the first time, the wall in his eyes seemed to crumble completely. "My father's name was Silas Callaway," he said, his voice low and strained. "This was all his. The ranch, the valley, the herd. 20 years ago, men like Henderson, Greedy men with paper and false promises, they broke him. They took the valley piece by piece. But my father was smarter than they were. He saw it coming. The history. It was finally beginning to surface. The night before the bank was to seize everything, Nate continued, his gaze lost in the shadows of the canyon. We drove the best of the herd in here, 40 head, the prize bloodline he'd spent his life building. We blocked the lower passage with a rock slide. The town thought they'd panicked and run into the canyon to their doom. They called it the Lost Herd. But they weren't lost. They were hidden. Opal's breath caught. You've been here all this time? For 20 years? My father made me promise. He told me to keep the herd safe. To wait. He said one day the valley would need the Callaway name again. He said someone worthy would come. Someone who saw value in what others called worthless. He died a month later. I've been keeping that promise ever since. The lamplight he kept burning in a hidden line shack. The hay he bought quietly in a town 60 miles away. The years of solitude. It was all a promise. A son's devotion to his father's last wish. Opal, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name. It sounded different in his mouth, solid and real. Henderson won't stop. If he finds out about the herd, he'll find a way to take them. You're not safe here. You should have taken his money. And let him win? She asked softly. Let him take the last of what your father saved? She looked from his tormented face to the quiet canyon behind him. No, I'm not leaving. His hand came up, and for a second she thought he was going to touch her. His fingers hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly. Then he let his hand fall. He looked like a man being torn in two, between the promise he'd kept for 20 years and the woman who had stumbled into the middle of it. The break came a week later. Henderson returned, but not alone. He came with the town sheriff and 2 hired riders. They rode straight to Opal's cabin, a writ held in Henderson's hand. Mrs. Thompson, Henderson announced, his voice booming with false authority. Under territorial law, I am claiming the unbranded livestock currently in your possession. They are not unbranded, Opal said, her voice shaking with rage, and they are not mine to give. Then whose are they? Henderson challenged. The ghost of Silas Callaway? His men laughed. Just then, Nate appeared, walking out from the canyon mouth, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stopped beside Opal, a silent, formidable presence. Henderson's eyes gleamed with triumph. Ah, the squatter. Sheriff, this is the man I told you about. Been living on public land, rustling strays. That's a lie, Opal said. This herd belongs to the Callaway estate, Nate said, his voice a low growl. Henderson laughed, a loud, ugly sound. The Callaway estate ceased to exist 20 years ago. I have the paperwork to prove it, and I also have this. He brandished the writ, a grazing lease, for the entire Lost Canyon tract, signed and sealed this morning. These cattle are on my lease, which makes them my problem. We'll be rounding them up and driving them to the sale yard in Harmony Creek. Opal stared at him, her blood running cold. A grazing lease. He had boxed them in with paper. Nate, do something, she pleaded in a whisper. But Nate just stood there, his face a mask of stone. The fight seemed to have gone out of him. He was trapped by 20 years of secrecy, by a promise that had no legal standing. He looked at Opal, his eyes full of a terrible despair. Go, Opal, he said, his voice hollow. Go now. This isn't your fight. He was pushing her away. He was giving up. To protect her, he was letting Henderson win. The sense of betrayal was a physical blow. She had trusted him, had believed they were in this together. And now he was sending her away, retreating back into his wall of silence. The herd, his father's legacy, was about to be stolen. And the man she was beginning to realize she loved was letting it happen. Her heart broke. She didn't go. She stood for a moment, the laughter of Henderson's men ringing in her ears, the sight of Nate's defeated posture searing itself into her memory. Then she turned and ran. Not away, but toward her cabin. She threw open the door, her mind racing, paper against truth. Henderson had his paper. She needed her own. She tore through the few books she owned, her hands searching for the slim portfolio that held the deed. She found it, and with it, the folded survey map the clerk had given her. She'd barely glanced at it before. Now she spread it on the table, her eyes scanning the lines, the numbers, the faded script, the Callaway breach. 300 acres. The line was clearly marked, running straight and true. And then it wasn't. At the canyon mouth, it jagged inward, following the creek for 100 yards before cutting back out. Her property line didn't end at the canyon mouth. It included the entrance. It included the meadow. It was a surveyor's quirk, a forgotten detail on a map for a piece of land no one had ever wanted to look at too closely. But it was there, in ink, legal. She wasn't done. She saddled her horse, her movements swift and desperate. She rode like the devil was chasing her, not away from the canyon, but toward Harmony Creek. She had to get there before Henderson could move the herd. She burst into the land office, startling the new clerk. "I need to see the county tax ledgers," she demanded, "for the last 20 years. The clerk, a young man with a face full of freckles, looked intimidated by her intensity. He hauled out the heavy, dust-covered books. Opal flipped through the pages, her fingers flying. She was looking for a ghost. Callaway. She found it. Not the main ranch, long since sold and broken up, but a tiny entry. Callaway, S. Homestead Parcel, Lost Canyon. A small, forgotten claim of 40 acres, right in the heart of the hidden valley. And every year, for 20 years, the minuscule property tax had been paid. In cash. By mail. The signature on the payment receipts was a simple, stark initial. N. Callaway. Nate hadn't just kept the herd. He had kept his father's last piece of land legally his, paying the dues from his solitude, a quiet act of defiance no one had ever noticed. She gathered the papers, her proof. It was all there. The map, the tax records, the truth. Back at the canyon, Henderson's men were trying to push the herd out. The cattle were agitated, unwilling to leave the valley they knew as home. Nate stood alone at the narrowest part of the trail, a human dam against their efforts. He wasn't fighting, just standing, his body a silent testament of refusal. "Get out of the way, Callaway," Henderson snarled, "or the sheriff will move you." Just then, they heard the thunder of hoofbeats. Opal appeared, her horse lathered, the sheriff riding hard beside her, his face grim. He'd met her on the trail, had seen the evidence in her hands. "Henderson, hold on," the sheriff commanded, dismounting. Opal slid from her horse and walked straight to Nate. She didn't look at Henderson. She looked at the man she had thought had abandoned her. "I didn't run," she said, her voice clear and strong. She turned to face Henderson, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "This is not your land to lease," she said, her voice ringing in the canyon. She held up her survey map. "My property line extends into this canyon. You are trespassing, Mr. Henderson. You and your men." Henderson paled. That's a mistake." "Is it?" Opal pressed, her voice like steel. "And I wonder, did you know about this when you arranged your lease?" She held up the tax ledger pages. "This is the Callaway homestead parcel. 40 acres in the heart of this valley. The taxes have been paid every year for 20 years by Nate Callaway. This land has never been public. It has always been his. Your lease is fraudulent." The canyon went silent. The meaning of it all landed like a thunderclap. The secret kept. The promise honored. The quiet, dogged loyalty of a son who had given up his life to protect his father's legacy. Henderson sputtered, his face a blotchy red. "It's a trick. They're unbranded cattle." At that moment, the lead cow, the one whose calf Opal had saved, pushed past the hired riders. She walked calmly through the chaos, right up to Nate, and nudged her head against his chest. He put a hand on her neck, a lifetime of familiarity in the gesture. The rest of the herd, seeing their leader, settled and grew quiet, their eyes on Nate. The animals themselves had chosen. The sheriff looked from the papers in his hand to Henderson's panicked face, to the man and the woman and the cow standing together as one. He knew the truth when he saw it. "Henderson," he said, his voice hard, "you've got a lot of explaining to do back in town." The fight was over. Henderson's claim had collapsed on the truth Opal had uncovered. She had not only saved the herd, she had saved him. She had given him back his name and his history in front of the very world that had forgotten him. Months later, the autumn sun warmed the porch of the old Calloway homestead. Not Opal's lonely cabin, but the one deep in the valley, its roof now mended, its windows clean, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Opal sat on the steps, leaning her head back against a post. Nate sat beside her, oiling a piece of leather. The silence between them was no longer full of questions, but of peace. The herd, the Calloway herd, grazed in the meadow below. Her own few head of cattle were mixed in with them, the beginning of a new future. Henderson was gone, his fraud exposed, his name a curse in Harmony Creek. The town that had once mocked Opal now spoke of her with a grudging respect. The woman who bought the worthless land. The woman who uncovered the truth of the lost canyon. Nate set down his work. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. His touch was warm and solid. "My father said someone worthy would come," he said, his voice soft. "Someone who saw value in what others called worthless. He was right. It was you, Opal. It was always you." She turned her head, her cheek brushing his shoulder. She had come here with nothing, a discarded woman looking for a place to hide. And in the heart of a canyon everyone else had forgotten, she had found everything. A home, a purpose. A man who had been waiting 20 years for someone to see him. "He also said the valley would need the Calloway name again," she murmured. Nate smiled, the expression transforming his rugged face, wiping away the last of the shadows. "Our name," he corrected her gently. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of sunshine and second chances, a promise kept, and a new one just beginning. Finding what the world has overlooked can sometimes lead you to everything you were meant to have. We hope this story reminds you that value is not always what is seen, but what is tended to in secret. If you enjoyed Opal and Nate's journey, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story of the heart. Have you ever found something beautiful where no one else thought to look? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep searching for the hidden meadows in your own life.